And now, without further delay, let's begin today's event, sponsored by Onfido and hosted by American Banker. I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, and that is Janet King. Janet, you have the floor.
Thanks. Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Janet King, Vice President of Research at Arizent, parent company to American Banker. Going digital took an evolutionary leap forward when the pandemic changed how we work, interact, and conduct our lives, and the banking industry has been no exception. As one respondent to a recent Arizent Research and American Banker survey put it, quote, "We were already undergoing a fairly massive shift to digitizing all of our processes, and this just led to a great acceleration." In today's conversation, we will draw on results from research conducted by American Banker in partnership with Onfido to better understand these changes, particularly in the area of digital customer identity verification. More specifically, we'll use our time today to explore the top digital customer engagement priorities for banks and to learn more about how banks are balancing the need to verify identity with the desire to enable a secure and frictionless customer experience. Our goal at the end of today is really to provide you with a new perspective on what your peers are doing and a better understanding of how different identity verification strategies might benefit your business. Joining me today is Jim Wangler, VP of Financial Services at Onfido. Onfido is a provider of digital identity verification solutions that leverage AI-based technology and facial biometrics to verify and onboard customers remotely and securely. Jim is an accomplished senior executive with over 11 years of experience across the financial services, identity, and access management and healthcare industries. And currently, he's heading up the financial services team at Onfido. So thanks for being here today with me, Jim.
Thank you for having me, Janet.
All right, so let's get started. The research that we will be discussing today was conducted online among the American Banker audience during April of this year. We had a total of 200 banking leaders complete the survey, and all of those respondents have some level of knowledge or involvement, most a significant or moderate amount of involvement, with their institution's customer onboarding processes, including identity verification and authentication. 2 out of 3 of those respondents hold executive or senior level positions, and just under 1/2 were from banks with 20 billion or more in assets. So that's just to provide you with a little bit of context about who we surveyed and how we conducted that research. So before we dive into the data from the research we conducted with Onfido, I think it's important to take just a moment to reflect on how significantly the events of the past 15 months or so have impacted how banks engage with their customers. In some industry research that we conducted at American Banker, we found that 3 out of 4 bankers note that COVID-19 will significantly accelerate the digital transformation of the industry, with many thinking it will lead to permanent changes in business models or at least accelerate that change by 3 to 4 years. At the same time, 87%, so almost 9 out of 10 banking leaders, report evidence of an industry-wide increase in fraud over the past 12 months. And the combination of this massive acceleration in all things digital and the increased risk of fraud is placing new challenges on banks as they strive to deliver those secure and frictionless customer onboarding experiences. So Jim, I'd like to pause here and get your opinion and see whether you think those statistics on some of these broader industry trends are at all surprising.
No, not surprising at all. You know, firms really have been putting a huge amount of effort into making their services available digitally. I just think that COVID accelerated the prioritization of these projects. So I think what it also has shown light on is how far behind the curve that many of these organizations actually are, and the need for them to get their houses in order to properly service their consumers in a digital-first era. As far as the increases in fraud goes, we've also seen this. We've seen increases in fraud of up to about 41% around identity document fraud last year alone. And we saw the changes in the attack patterns as well, where it's moved more to a 24/7 operation when historically there were larger spikes around traditional working hours.
Wow. So in many cases, it feels like it was like this perfect storm of factors that hit us all at once. And against that backdrop, there certainly are a number of key customer engagement priorities that are shaping banks' agendas for the coming year. And you can see some of those outlined here on this chart. Some of the core areas of focus for bankers are process automation to simplify and enhance the customer experience, digital onboarding, and again, fraud prevention and mitigation. So all three of those were mentioned by more than half and up to as many as 2/3 of those that we surveyed. So really very top of mind. Enhancing self-service capabilities was a not too distant fourth among banks overall. Notably there, what we saw is that global and national banks are 2 times as likely as regional banks or credit unions to prioritize self-service. So that's a bit of an interesting difference. And it's also noteworthy that 1 out of 3 report that contextualizing the customer journey with AI and machine learning is a top priority. So we're starting to see, AI, which has certainly always been on the radar, becoming a higher priority, as well as banks kind of are moving to really accelerate that digital transformation. So Jim, what are your thoughts on how banks are stacking up these priorities? And do you think that generally we're seeing focus in the right areas?
I do believe that customer experience is at the forefront and exactly where banks should be prioritizing time, effort, and spend. Anything that they can do to get a competitive edge on that and provide a better experience is going to work out for them in the end. This potentially could include AI, but it's also ensuring that the blocking and tackling aspects of process automation and digital verification are priorities as well. As we know, AI is only as good as the data you're feeding it to learn. I would agree, though, that the digital onboarding, being the second most chosen priority, is very, very important. When you look at it, the first impression is always most important. In some of the research that we've conducted here at Onfido, we found that nearly 60% of people have abandoned the sign-up experience because it's too long or too cumbersome. So it's certainly a critical thing for firms to get right.
Yeah, and I think it's noteworthy that while it is the second priority, there's still fully 40% of the banks that we surveyed who are not listing it among their top priorities. So I think that's also kind of an interesting point, right? We're seeing it pop to the top of the list, but that maybe even along with AI should be more broadly prioritized if these banks really are expecting to make significant improvements in customer engagement.
Certainly.
So we did see a few differences by institution size. So we still saw process automation and customer engagement as top priorities, but both the smallest and largest banks, as you can see on this chart, ranked process automation as the customer engagement top priority for the next year. So they were both looking in that direction, while mid-sized banks are more often and more broadly focused on digital onboarding. So that's kind of an interesting and I think somewhat notable difference in sort of how these different sized institutions are thinking about these priorities for the coming year. So let's explore that in a bit more detail and look at the things that are either bolstering or hindering a bank's readiness to scale their onboarding efforts with the right approach to digital customer identity verification. And I think it's helpful to look at some of the areas where banks are having success as well as where they might be struggling. And these are quotes from some open-ended questions we asked about why they feel well prepared or not. And in general, it appears that institutions who feel well prepared to support digital customer identity verification already have some core technology in place. They've made a commitment to an investment in process automation and digital onboarding, and they generally have established a plan for educating and training users to adopt new approaches. So essentially, those banks, and that's on sort of the left-hand side of this chart, have many of the pieces in place that allow them to continue to drive their digital transformation forward and scale their onboarding capabilities. On the other hand, the banks getting stuck are lacking in many of those areas and are slowed by a need to quickly ramp up technology, digitize processes, and educate customers. So Jim, I think this is interesting because digitizing processes and having the right technology in place is clearly critical to scaling onboarding efforts. But many of these respondents also touched on the customer piece of this equation in their comments. So what do you think that banks should be thinking about to increase customer acceptance and adoption of different digital identity verification approaches?
I think the biggest thing is to provide options. It's never going to be a one-size-fits-all as far as user preferences go. But if you can take an approach that provides multiple options to verify their identity, that will help with customer adoption. We've seen a rise in adoption of facial biometrics as a method to verify identity. That technology has made vast improvements to ensure better accuracy and speed, and I think that will only grow over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right there. I mean, that idea of giving customer choice is something that we see come up in research for so many different topics, and onboarding, certainly it's a really critical aspect of that experience for customers. So I think these roadblocks are really important to address because an ineffective approach to digital customer identity verification has real consequences, not only for banks, but also their customers. And banking leaders largely recognize this, with a significant number citing increases in things like identity fraud and rising costs from fraudulent activity or claims, and challenges retaining customers and their trust at the top of the list of perceived consequences from having that sort of ineffective digital customer identity verification process. So there's a lot of things on their minds, but Jim, in your conversations with bank leaders, which of these risks is most often keeping them up at night, and how do you think the right technology solutions can help to mitigate some of those concerns?
Yeah, so certainly identity fraud is a great concern, as is pointed out as the top pick here. But I would also say that customer churn is a big one as well, and in the sense of session abandonment or customer drop-off. I believe that that's almost equally as important when you think about the opportunity cost lost because of someone abandoning a session or an experience. When you think about solving for this, and the right technology solutions should be critical in three main areas. One, customer experience. Two, fraud and risk mitigation. And three, operational efficiency aspects. So when I look at this, I think the best way to do this is via remote document and biometric verification. When you look at the customer experience there, you're able to simply and easily onboard a user from their phone in minutes with just a simple click of a button of taking a picture of a document and a selfie, 100% digital. From a fraud and risk mitigation, you're ensuring that the transactions you're performing online have a real identity attached to them. It's not just an email account or a PIN number. It actually has the real human, the facial biometric and their government-issued document tied to that transaction. And then thirdly, the operational efficiency component. And this looks at automating the current processes that are typically manual, i.e. forcing users to go into a branch office to complete a transaction, forcing them to call an 800 number, something along those lines. So those are three key areas that I believe are very critical for organizations to evaluate and find the right technology solutions to wrap around those.
Yeah, that's great. And, luckily we have a growing number of tools at banks' disposal to improve their ability to quickly and securely verify customers' identities in many of the ways that you're talking about. And the data here suggests that banks are fairly familiar with most of those options and, in fact, give a lot of them high marks as being very effective. So traditional tools like PINs and passwords, network or device identification, those things all remain an important part of the mix. But what really stands out to me here is the growing acceptance and trust in some of the newer approaches like facial biometrics and photo-based identity document verification, that idea that you just talked about of being able to take a selfie and instantly verify who you are. And both of those approaches were being viewed as highly affected by 8 out of 10 of the banking leaders that we spoke to. So why do you think those kind of approaches, Jim, the facial biometrics, the photo-based identity document verification, are getting such high marks for effectiveness in banks' onboarding efforts?
I think the biggest thing is because they're easy, right? When you look at it, it's as simple as taking a selfie, and it's fast. And I also think there's a higher degree of customer confidence in the facial biometrics. The fact that they are able to take that picture, it is their face, gives them a higher level of confidence. Pins and passwords have been around for a really long time, but can be easily stolen and or forgotten. It's really hard to forge a facial biometric if you have the right technology in place.
Absolutely. And have you seen a real increase in interest or acceptance around those technologies, particularly the photo-based identity document verification, since the onset of the pandemic? And are you seeing a real shift in that from your banking customers?
Absolutely. And we're seeing it in multiple aspects of the identity lifecycle as well. So typically handling much of the digital onboarding type use cases, but now the facial biometric has been introduced into higher level transactions. So if you think about loan origination or wire transfers, different authentication mechanisms, facial biometrics has grown in popularity to address those use cases in addition to just the digital onboarding.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. And I think that it's helpful to look more specifically at how those two approaches in particular might be helpful for banks in the fight against fraud. So we've talked about that a little bit in our conversation today, and concerns about identity fraud topped the list of risk from an ineffective digital customer identity verification process. It was, among the top 2 or 3 things we talked about a few slides back. And that's not terribly surprising given that many sources cite identity theft as the fastest growing crime in the United States. But fraudulent documents are at the core of this challenge, and bankers are admitting that they're concerned with a number of kinds of document fraud, including forged documents, counterfeit documents, lookalikes, and more. So, Jim, specifically, how can photo-based identity document verification help mitigate the risk from these types of document fraud?
Yeah, so I think it's important that the technology utilizes a hybrid mix of AI, machine learning, and human experts. When you look at these documents, there's hundreds of security features that are built into the actual documents. So when we look to analyze fraudulent documents and categorize them into 3 categories, data validation, meaning checking the document to ensure that it has valid data in all the right places. Data consistency, which is around ensuring that how information is shown up in the documents are consistent across the multiple areas that they would be showing up. And then third is the visual authenticity. So things like the photos, the background patterns, the fonts, ensuring that all 3 of those categories line up. So the technology should have AI on the front end that's taking the first pass at analyzing that document and looking at all those different areas and security features, and then rating that. And then the human expert can be inserted if there are certain thresholds that are met or categorized. But this defense in depth strategy from a document verification standpoint provides a pretty high barrier for fraudsters to overcome.
Okay, so let's focus in on facial biometrics for a moment, because like photo-based identity document verification, this approach to verifying customer identity was also ranked by 8 out of 10 bankers as highly effective. So it was another area that they're having quite a bit of success with. And here we see more than half also strongly agree that the use of such technology would give their bank a competitive edge in market. However, those same decision makers also worry that facial biometrics is not widely accepted by consumers and results in high abandonment rates. So I think this highlights one of the key challenges for this technology. It seems like industry buy-in is there, but how can banks integrate facial biometrics into the onboarding experience in a way that encourages consumer adoption and trust while not introducing more friction for the customer, Or I guess conversely, Jim, do you think that these decision makers are worried, overtly worried about customer acceptance, and maybe that's not actually an accurate barrier?
Well, friction certainly is a barrier, and leaders should be concerned about it to ensure that the user experience is as frictionless as possible. However, I do believe that transparency is also really important. It's important to tell your users why you're asking for a biometric and what the benefit is to them. If they understand the value, i.e. this helps reduce fraudulent claims, it provides a more personalized user experience, et cetera, then they'll feel good about the friction and they'll accept the friction. I think with any verification solution, there's always going to be some level of friction, but there needs to be some level of value that the user feels for going through that friction. And then it becomes a win-win for both parties. So it's almost a bigger thing to educate the users and position the friction as a positive benefit versus it being a negative process and barrier to them completing the transactions they're trying to complete.
Great. Okay, that's really great insight, and actually a great segue to this, because we asked these banking leaders how important different features and benefits are in their decision to purchase or upgrade identity verification solutions. And maybe it comes as no surprise that we see that they place a high level of importance on solutions that deliver an improved user experience for customers as well as employees. But they also value solutions that will deliver more automated and compliant workflows, are easily integrated with existing systems, and have flexible biometric verification capabilities to meet different user needs. So I think there's a lot of things that sort of are table stakes for the technology, but to your point, those things have to be paired with education and transparency on the part of the bank to really drive consumer acceptance and adoption. So we've covered quite a bit of ground today, and I think much of what we discussed circles back to this reality that delivering secure, frictionless customer experiences is hard, but tapping into the right mix of data, tools, and technologies is really key to finding the right balance in your bank's digital onboarding and identity verification processes. And I think a few comments from survey respondents underscore some things to keep in mind as you pick the right strategy for your bank. They capture some of the things that bank leaders are doing to balance efforts to have that frictionless customer experience with the need to verify customer identity. Some of those things include, giving customers tools. Again, this respondent says, basically we're investing in a great deal of self-service. Personalizing the customer experience is another thing. Understanding that you have to keep in mind that not all customers are technologically capable, and figuring out a way for even the less technically inclined customers to have a smooth experience. I think that kind of circles back to your comment earlier, Jim, where you were talking about having multiple ways for customers to identify themselves in different approaches. Another key is really tapping into new technology. So this respondent said, we're now adding features of digital verification, such as taking photos of your driver's license, ID, or birth certificate, and we feel these new technologies will make it more accessible to our customers. So again, tap into new technology, but also maybe tap into some consumer behaviors that have been established in other sectors and sort of bringing those over into the financial services experience. And then finally, layering up. So we offer multiple means for customers to verify identity, granting more flexibility for the customer to handle verification in a way most comfortable and or convenient for them. So again, going back to that multi-approach sort of mentality to identity verification. So any final thoughts, Jim, from you before we open this up to Q&A from the audience?
I think you communicated very well there. Give customers options. That's most important. Communicate the value of leveraging an identity verification solution, why it's important to them, and lastly, make it easy. Simple is better, and less is more.
Great. Well, thanks, Jim. You've certainly provided a lot of great insights into how different identity verification processes and strategies might benefit banks, and I've certainly enjoyed chatting about it with you. So let's just take a minute to open this up to questions from the audience and see what we have. So, Jim, our first question is a bit of a broad one, but it's asking whether you envision a world with no in-person customer interaction. So what are your thoughts on that as we kind of move into this latter stage and hopefully accelerate out of the events of 2020 and early 2021?
Yeah, and I think that comes down to customer preference. So if a customer prefers to not have any in-person interaction, the bank or service provider should be able to provide that. However, I don't believe that every consumer wants a completely personless customer interaction. So I think, again, it's one where the company should prepare for it and provide the option. Again, accommodating what customer preferences would be.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you. And the next question is asking whether you think the end of the pandemic might mean a return to previous behaviors. So, earlier we spoke about the fact that there's been this, massive acceleration to digital channels and methods of communication, and specifically with respect to onboarding new accounts and whatnot. So what do you think? And again, this is a little bit of an opinion-based, kind of looking to the future. Do you think the end of the pandemic will mean a return to previous behaviors, or will something stick?
I think certain things will certainly stick. I think the consumer expectation around more products and services delivered in a digital format will only increase. I believe that we've seen ways in which consumers can consume products and services in ways that we didn't think was possible before. So I think that in many aspects, this digital first type scenario will prevail and will continue to expand. As far as the fraud goes, I think that will continue to increase. Fraudsters will continue to become more sophisticated, and organizations need to continue to develop defense in depth strategies to prevent that from happening. But certainly there are behaviors that have changed that probably will stay.
Okay, well, thank you, Jim. I think that's all the time we have today, but I want to thank everybody for joining us, and thank you again to Jim and Onfido for partnering with us on the research and sponsoring today's webinar. Remember, if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, you can download it directly from the resource folder. And if you have additional questions or want more information about how Onfido can help your business, please email hello@onfido.com or visit them at onfido.com. So have a great day.